suspension and Cherokee projects. Point of no return here. Started stripping everything down to get ready for the lift. I'm going to go with some custom front coilovers. That means I'm cutting away some of this stuff, remove the entire front suspension, degreased and cleaned up the entire section. Started cleaning off the whole unibody so I can get ready for the Ruff Stuff Specialties. Ruff Stuff Specialties frame stiffeners, or unibody stiffeners. Doing some custom coilover mounts. It's going to go up and through and into the engine compartment. I'm hoping to go with some 12-inch coilovers. So simplify the front suspension, give me some really good tunable suspension. There's no kits that I can find for Cherokees, so Rock and Road Performance is going to be manufacturing me some custom 12-inch coilover mounts for this project, and their cross member for their long arm kit is also going to be part of the package. I'm going to go with a Rubicon Express 5.5-inch lift springs for the rear, which you can see there, with some smooth body 12-inch travel shocks in the back that'll match the front. That'll be cut into the rear wheel wells and come into the rear section of the Cherokee. So it should be a good riding, tunable suspension. This started out life as a two-door Cherokee with two-wheel drive. So right there is your two-wheel drive suspension. If you ever buy a two-wheel drive Cherokee, you find that it's basically got the same solid axle, missing the actual pumpkin. So you do not have four-wheel drive, but you've got exactly the same body mounts, exactly the same suspension, same arms, same brakes, everything. So converting a two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive, if you're doing what we're doing here, you might as well start with a two-wheel drive, because everything else gets swapped anyway, shy of the you do have to do something with your transmission and transfer case. A lot has been done. This is the passenger side. Right there, if you can see, that used to be the lower arm mount, control arm mount for the front suspension. You got to cut that out. It's going to have long arms on it, so you want to get that all out of the way. I drilled the rivets, cut off the metal, and then flap disced off the balance of the metal. Now I'm getting prepped because our coilover is going to come right through, right about here. It's going to be, we're going to cut away part of the shock tower, the spring perch, and part way to where the shock mounts and the new shock mount's going to come up and into the engine compartment. I'm going to support it with a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That way when it comes through, it'll have not only be welded to a frame stiffener in the front, because you'll see that next. I'm going to cut this through, so I wanted to cut the spring guide off to get that out of the way. It's just tack welded on, or not tack welded, it's quite a bit of welding right on there. You basically just take a cut-off disc and cut right along the weld. It is almost all the way around. Nice thing is they didn't weld the back side very much, so it's pretty much where you can get to the flap disc. Then you just work it off, bend it, breaks right off. You can see that's how it mounts. There it is. So now it's cleaned up, so I can start marking and cutting how my shock tower is going to go through, my coilover tower technically. So it's coming out all right. Unibody stiffeners. I'm going to be installing these Ruff Stuff Specialties unibody stiffeners made specifically for the XJ. They're weld-in, super strong, fit perfectly, kind of jack them into place. They come bare metal, and you get them. And you see bare metal on one side. And of course, I don't know if you can see up there, but I just had to strip all of this actually had a factory undercoating, or at least somebody who did it aftermarket. A lot of stripping to get all that black tar-like stuff off of there, but you want the metal to be pretty much cleaned down to bare metal anywhere you're going to weld for sure. And then of course that brings up a huge problem when you bring things down to bare metal, is rust. And especially in rust places where you leave bare metal where water and moisture can get in, it'll just sit in there and rust away from the inside out. So what do? You can't weld through regular paint. That is why you really need to get, for anything, quarter panels, any metal at which you're going to weld to something where you're going to have some gaps where water can get in, and you have bare metal, you should be using some form of weld through primer that's designed specifically to be welded through. Usually have zinc or some other rust prohibitive product in it, and you basically spray everything that's coated completely with the zinc rust through primer, so that when I weld these things up to that rail, I won't have rust in between the two parts. The weld will basically burn right through that paint without contaminating the weld, and in theory I will have a years of life with no rust, and it doesn't affect the strength in welding. So of course that's what I did. Primed it, got it ready to go yesterday so I'd be able to weld today. But just want to kind of cover that. Weld through primer. It does exist. Do not use standard primer. That's specifically designed. Now granted, it's not cheap. Here in California, that's $40 a can. Compared to what, $5 or $6 for some Rust-Oleum? But you can't weld through Rust-Oleum. In theory, it'll burn through it, but you're going to contaminate the weld, and who knows what gas it's off-putting. So in this case, you can weld this. It's not going to poison you, and it's designed for it, and it's rust prohibitive. The only other thing I did to these Ruff Stuff rails is I added some additional, you can kind of see, I added some additional 10 millimeter threaded nuts into it to add 3 additional locations for skid plates and things like that later. So if I don't need them, I don't need them, but it's way easier to put them in now, because otherwise I could drill and tap this metal. This metal is about, I think it's 3/16 inch, and I prefer to go at least a 1/4 inch thick if I'm going to tap it and expect it to hold up to anything. So figured I'd weld in some nuts so I'd be ready to go, and that's it. Next time you see these, they'll be hopefully welded to the unibody. Well, another problem to overcome when you're installing these frame stiffeners, you really need to put a clamp on the outside of it to the inside to pull it toward the sheet metal as close as possible to keep that gap down. Problem is, on the driver's side, all the fuel lines, brake lines, all kinds of stuff run along the inside of that unibody channel. So getting a clamp on there without damaging the fuel lines could be problematic, and you really need to clamp it and get it nice and tight before you start welding it, so you have as little gap as possible. So I'm going to fabricate a quick little kind of like a little piece so that I can extend off those brake lines. So hopefully this will work. Okay, the plan: 2x2 120 wall scrap that I have laying around the shop. Doesn't have to be 2x2, it could be pretty much anything. I'm going to slice it right down the middle on each side. So I'll end up with 2 basically U-channels that I can put around it. Basically the cut edge will basically slide past the brake lines, come up against the frame, and then I'll be able to put the clamp on this surface here and clamp down, while the cut side will basically clear the brake line. So the brake lines will end up going right on through inside this channel and won't damage the brake lines. We'll see how this works. Alright, I'm going to use a cut-off disc. If anybody cut a lot of metal. You could try to hacksaw it and everything. What I found is one of the best tools for cutting steel, cutting plate, cutting anything you want. These nice, these are from Home Depot, the Diablo brand, but it's a metal cutoff disc. What makes a cutoff disc different than a grinding disc is it's thin, and you use it in this form, so it basically cuts right through metal. It is expend, kind of like if you take a look at this disc here, it's cut quite a bit, and so it basically wears down as you cut, but it cuts really good, easy to cut straight lines, and works really well. And much faster than trying to do it with a Sawzall or something, or a hacksaw. That's about it. And also, whenever you're cutting any metal, highly recommend using one of these face shields. You don't want metal particles of any kind getting in your eyeballs, and that seems to really work well. Okay, there we go. Cutoff disc. Put that up. Cut this one in half so I'd have a few more brackets just in case. And there it is. And if we come up underneath the frame here, we'll be able to put that right like that. And then I'll be able to clamp without damaging any fuel lines. Look at that, beautiful. And there we go. Works excellent. And I use the 2 transmission mounts. I'm starting from the transmission mounts and working outward because that way those 2 bolts have to line up. And earlier in the video you saw how I had welded in these nuts. I drilled holes in the unibody to match where these holes were. So I have 3 more bolt locations that I can basically add, gives me more spots to bolt things to later, and should work good. So we're about ready to start tacking this particular one in place, because this is where I'm starting from right here. Cross member, bolts line up. Got it clamped in, pulled against the body, so there's almost no gap between where I've got to fill in these rosette welds. And then these bolts pulled the bottom of this up right up against the frame perfectly. I'm going to use the jack right here to jack up these other sections. See how much gappage there is between the body? That's what these cuts are for, is to allow this to flex upward and bend with the contour of the unibody. So I'm going to start here because it'd be a bitch if these bolts didn't line up when you got it all set up. So I put the bolts in, centered it on that, and that's where I'm starting to work from, front to back. I'm going to do the front first since that doesn't have any cuts, and I'm going to clamp, I think, a couple more clamps in there to pull it, the front really close to it. And I'm going to put a jack up underneath the front just to make sure it's really up against the body. And then start burning this thing in. There we go, 2 clamps, nicely there. Jack under the front, make sure it's pushed up right up against the body. 2 bolts holding that. I'm going to burn this thing in. And those clamp brackets really work nicely. Look at that. Sandwich, straddling over those fuel lines. I could clamp it really tight. So. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's possible to weld this thing pretty, but I think structurally it's probably sound. You're welding the sheet from sheet metal to 3/16, and I tell you, it's not really neat looking weld. Definitely not looking really pretty, but it is solid, and it certainly isn't going anywhere, and it feels like it's nicely attached. So there it is. Now I think I'm just going to take a flat disc and clean up the welds just a little bit, make them flat at least, and then I'm going to use some seam sealer to seal all the holes. What I did is I pretty much just stitch welded in certain spots. On the back side, I stitch welded probably every 6 inches rather than trying to burn the entire length. This front section, it burns through the floor too much if you try to weld that upper bend, because that sheet metal right at the floor level was pretty darn thin, and it seemed to, you know, even the lowest setting with 030 wire, it would kind of burn through too much and just didn't feel like catching the carpet on fire. So I think if you went with 025 and a lower voltage, maybe it would work out. But I think structurally and with all the rosette welds and everything else, I don't think this thing's going to go anywhere anyway. At least it's certainly stronger than the basic original frame. There we go. Ground down. My 4 thread bowl holes. Just ground them down a little bit. They're not pretty or smooth, but once I paint it, it should be fine. Rough Stuff Specialties. I've also got the ones for the front. I'll be putting in there. Just I'm not ready to do that yet. I'm going to work on the cross member and front suspension first. Rough Stuff Specialties front frame stiffeners. Now I haven't really recorded much of the process here, but it looks ugly. I'm going to grind down most of these welds. I did the same as the main body stiffeners. I sprayed the backside of all these panels with weld through primer and the frame where I cleaned all the metal off. And I added Rough Stuff Specialties pretty much just has these strips coming down, but they don't have really any other holes. So I added some rosette holes, a bunch of just about 1/2 inch holes. See all those really nice round dots. That's just to add more surface area contact between these plates and the unibody, mainly because I'm going to be putting in coilover shocks and coilover mount on this, and I wanted to add as much extra strength as I could tying these plates to the body. And it's the last little piece I've got to get in. Notice all the extra round holes I've got, just the voids at which you just have edge welding. I added some rosettes in the middle, so, and then that will tie into the stiffener I've already got there. So that's that. And I'm going to show the other side where I've already finished it and ground down all the welds. So one other thing I did is I'm going to be putting the factory bumper back on here temporarily until I get an off-road bumper, but Rough Stuff didn't come with the actual holes where these would go through, any of the 3 mounting bumper holes, so it kind of surprised me. So I lined those up, marked them, drilled them out so that I can keep the factory bumper holes. This third bolt here, whoops, excuse the light, is already got a nut welded on the inside. These 2 outer ones have little snap pieces you've got to remove. So what I did is I welded on some nuts on the back side so that now I have them all welded on, so that'll tie everything in. So I can probably even mount an off-road bumper to those 3, plus using if you can see it, that extra hole right there on the bottom, you can actually put a nice big bolt right through there and tie everything together. So hopefully I'll be done with this part tonight, and then I'll be ready to start cutting out the shock original spring towers to make room for coilovers. And this is the side that I've already done. Same thing, there's the rosette welds are filled. Doesn't look super pretty, but it's hard because I think that weld through primer still does a lot of spackling and kind of makes it, the weld, somewhat unclean. So not too thrilled with the way the welds came out, but Really doesn't matter too much as long as you're nice and solid on the frame and you get a good contact and melt the parent material there to get it all tied together. It should be fine. Significantly stronger than just the standard sheet metal style unibody. So